So as I was doing, yes, as I was doing this, I was thinking to myself, what would be some questions if I were in the audience that I would ask, or questions that people in districts ask me? And so the first one around an improvement plan is, we already have a district plan for our English learners. Why should we create an additional one? Or why should we enhance the one that we've got? Which I think is a very fair question. So one of the things that we've seen in working with districts is that most districts that we've talked to say that their plan is really focused on compliance, that they may be taking baby steps to move it to a plan that's not just a compliance-driven plan, but one that actually provides coherence. But for the most part, these plans lack the coherence around professional development that's offered to teachers and leaders. There's a lack of coherence around what are the optimal classroom instructional practices, both in integrated and targeted English language development classes, and also around curricular materials. There's a lack of coherence in choosing curricular materials that both respond to our multilingual learners' strengths as well as their needs. So given that we heard all of that, we started to create a 3-year plan or draft. That's what you're looking at here, that would develop a plan over time. And to do this work, I think, is really powerful professional learning for leadership teams who take this on. And you see the different colors here. Each of those colors represents one of our professional learning essentials, which we'll get to as we talk about the components of the plan. So let's take a look at the 3 components. And again, as I share these, think about what, if any, of the aspects might be beneficial in your roles, or do any of these components speak to you? Again, even if you're thinking, well, we're not taking on this entire systemic improvement plan work. So when we think about a plan and the work that we've done in the past, especially with, I think it was about 23 districts in New York a couple of years ago, is first a language development approach, which guides and defines what do you mean by optimal instructional practices and programs for multilingual learners. A set of core competencies that for both teachers and leaders. And then finally, a professional learning plan that's grounded in our professional learning essentials and addresses the competencies that you've determined. So let's start with the language development approach. Quite simply, the language development approach is a place that really tries to capture your best thinking, grounded in research, grounded in evidence, around the best instructional practices for your multilingual learners. Right? The components you see here aren't set in stone, but most of the times when I see districts working on these kind of plans, they're making sure they really carefully define what do they mean by integrated, targeted ELD, what do they mean by scaffolding, how do they define academic discourse if that's something they're looking to promote. There's parts for academic and multilingual learner standards, culturally responsive teaching, and other components. So here's, and I don't know how well this graphic comes through, but here's a sample graphic that shows the components of a language development approach that districts in New York were working towards. And so you see all of these aspects are working towards instructional shifts that will then lead to quality instruction for the multilingual learners. So that's one sample language development approach. Again, it's not set in stone. Another one could look like this. So here's a language development approach with a number of components. This one that really is emphasizing the importance of authentic communication in reading, writing, listening, speaking, representing, if it's artistic representation, interpreting. So Again, districts can decide for themselves what are the key components that they want to work with in developing with leadership teams. So let's take a look. I just have one sample here. This was, again, work that we did with these districts in New York, in which we had them try and define academic discourse. And I can't tell if this may be a little bit too small to read, but what you see here is two districts who are in the process of drafting their working definitions, and you can see by the post-its getting feedback and then iterating on those definitions. And just like we believe that students develop understanding by using language to process their ideas, when we did this work with districts, just the conversations that people were having around what do we really mean by academic discourse was so powerful. And then, of course, we might provide some research, some readings to help ground them. But that they came away with really powerful definitions that they could then share with the rest of their district and then think about, well, if this is what we mean by academic discourse, then how do we develop it? What does it look like in our classrooms? Can we capture evidence, videos of students engaged in meaningful academic discourse? So I thought what we might do is try this a little bit. Instead of working on academic discourse, I was going to have all of us take a minute or two in the chat to jot down a sentence or two on how would you define scaffolding. And obviously, in a sentence or two, you're not going to capture everything. But I thought it might be interesting to try that. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to stop talking for a minute or two, give it a minute or two to type something in the chat. Don't hit return yet until I tell, and then obviously it'll waterfall all of the responses at the same time, and then we'll read through those responses. So again, go into the chat, think about your definition of scaffolding, write a sentence or two, and then stop, and I'll bring us back together in 2 minutes. Take about another 30 seconds to add something into the chat. Again, if I see some people are already starting to hit return, which is fine, but if you haven't, great, wait, but that's all right if you're already starting. All right, so let's do this. I'm going to count 3, 2, 1, and then go ahead and hit return, and then they'll all come out. And what I'm going to ask folks to do is just skim through them, and in looking at other people's definitions, pick out one thing that you'd say, oh, I'd add that to mine. That's a great idea. And then maybe this is crazy. Maybe we can get someone to unmute and share out what they would have added to their definition, or if not, we can just put it in the chat. Like, what did you learn from your colleagues? So when I count to 3, hit return, and then read through some of the responses. I'll read through as well, and then we'll come back together. So 3, 2, 1, go ahead and hit return. I see some really nice responses here. All right, if anyone wants to unmute and is willing to share something that they picked up from someone else that they would add to theirs, feel free to unmute. Maybe we can hear, I see that, thanks, Ann, put in what she liked about someone else, but maybe we can hear from 1 or 2 people, and if you're not comfortable doing that, add in the chat. So I'll give folks a second to see if they're willing to chime in.
I saw that a lot of people added to help students reach their goals. I would add that to mine.
Nice, great. Other things that people, yeah.
I saw one response that said that scaffolding was both a process or it could be process and tools.
I love that. Yeah, yeah. Sort of the planned in scaffolding and also scaffolding at the moment-to-moment supports. Lovely. Yep, it's great. One more, maybe? One more addition you'd add?
I would have added to mine that it's that you're slowly pulling back on that as the student becomes more capable. I forgot that part.
Great. Yeah, this is great. You can just see, you know, we get so many different responses. Of course, they're definitely connected to each other, but I think it's such a valuable thing to do is to define these things. And then what does that look like in the classroom? Because often you ask 50 different people what scaffolding is, and I get 50 different, very different responses. And if we're not on the same page, and then it's like, oh yeah, we scaffold. What do you mean by that? So I think this is a super helpful task. Again, even if you're not creating a big plan, just focusing a little bit of time on what is scaffolding. I remember, you know, working with a teacher who's teaching AP, I think it was AP English, and he said, oh, scaffolding, yeah, that's something I do with my lower end classes. And I thought to myself, wow, scaffolding should always be something that you use to push students beyond where they're at. So you should always have instruction beyond what they can do independently. So it shouldn't be for one or another group of students. But anyway, so this kind of work I think is really important and would be part of any language development approach. So thank you all for your responses. They were great. All right. Oh, I forgot to say, if you were stuck, it didn't seem like it, you know, I could ask you, okay, if you can't define it, what's an example of it? That's good too. So as a way of helping people to concretize it. Okay, so, you know, what's the purpose of creating some kind of language development approach? Well, Well, it creates some kind of coherent approach to multilingual learners so that, you know, when new teachers come in and they say, well, you know, how do I work with these students? There's something that says, this is what we believe in. And it can guide, and these are just some, it can guide what you're doing in professional learning, what coaching looks like, classroom observations. I mean, so many times I've seen classroom observations, unfortunately, focus on the window dressing, you know, is the standard written on the board, and, you know, bell to bell instruction, all of that. I'm not saying any of those are bad, but I want classroom observations focused on students that connect to what we really think is our best practices, instructional practices. So also selecting curriculum. Does this new curriculum align to our approach to how we think our kids learn? And as I mentioned, teacher onboarding. So, and I'm sure there's others that I'm missing. Second part of that systemic improvement plan is core competencies. So now, if we've defined aspects of quality instruction, well, what are the competencies that folks need? The core ones, not everyone, but what are some core ones? And this is not just for teachers, this is for leaders as well. And so when I think of core competencies, I sort of think of what are the skills, what's the knowledge, what are the key dispositions that teachers and leaders need to support their multilingual learners. I use, when I'm going to share some core competencies that we just drafted, but they're based on understanding languages, key principles of English learner instruction, which again, I think is on the resources page. I think it's from 2013, but it's still, I think, 6 principles that are research-based and are really powerful to, again, provide sort of coherent basis for language development approach and core competencies. So here are a couple of competencies, and what I'm going to ask folks to do is skim through these. I think there's 5 of them. Let's see. So I guess I'll just add these. I'm going to ask you to skim through them, and it's terrible that I'm giving instructions now that you can see them because I'm asking you to do double duty. But look at these, skim through them, and then choose one that you think would be a nice area of focus for the upcoming year. And why did you choose that one? So for example, I chose number 4 about considering students' home languages, cultural backgrounds, interests, and previous academic experiences as key assets, because I could say that I think that our teachers and coaches do a great job of tapping into kids' prior experiences and interests, but I think we might be able to become more consistent in knowing how to leverage these assets to build students' content knowledge, language, and disciplinary skills simultaneously. So that might be one I pick, saying, hey, we could maybe focus on this one competency. So with that, I'm going to give folks, again, another minute or two. Choose one. There may be more than one, that's fine. And if you want, you can add in the chat, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just write why. Why that one? Why did that one speak to you? Okay, so go ahead and I'll put myself on mute. And you don't have to wait this time. You can just add it in the chat.
I want to give an idea. I don't know.
Sure, go right ahead.
We've been. I am from Riding School District High School. We've been in contact with people from Polytech. They are very helpful. Very helpful. Very. So. Well, in case you want to explore for ELLs, for the kind of careers, please consider them. They are very, very good, very good.
Great. If you could add it into the chat, because that way we can go back afterwards, that would be super helpful. It's very interesting as I'm reading the competencies. And again, these are just ones we drafted. These aren't set in stone, but it's interesting to see a lot of people, no surprise, are picking number 5 because of the pandemic. But certainly, I think number 1 and 2 as well are coming up. So when we ask people, one way is to provide a number of core competencies like these. Another way is when working with teachers, coaches, and leaders to come up with their own. What do they think the core competencies should be for both? And then what we'll do is we'll ask people to, once they've chosen a small number of competencies, think about the value again of defining what that means. So if you're choosing number 1 about providing opportunities that require and help students to authentically use language, okay, what does that mean? So you can see, I won't read the definition here, but you can see there's a focus here on helping students acquire the language they need to speak purposefully. And yes. Sorry, I thought there was a comment. And also the notion of information gaps to build up ideas. So in defining these competencies, again, it's helping all the adults to process their understanding of these things, and then creating space for examples. What does that competency look like? How do we develop that competency? And reflection for teachers and leaders, where am I on a continuum, and what might help support me to move forward? So I'd want to give adults that opportunity as well. Let's see where to go. And then I'm sure people are already thinking about this, but what's the purpose of core competencies? Well, obviously it's to be used in professional learning when you identify what is it you want to focus on, educator self-reflection, coaching conversations, and then also to think about if you identified what quality instruction should look like in that language development approach, then the core competencies help people think about, well, how do we get there? And what's the gap between where we want to be in terms of educator capacity and where are we now? So it's a nice reflective piece for people. Okay, second question I asked myself. We've offered a lot of professional development on top of multilingual learners over the last couple of years, but we really don't see its impact in the classroom. Why is that? What can we do about it? So the last part of our systemic improvement plan is this notion of creating a professional learning plan and having it guided by our PD essentials. So a professional learning plan is just a plan that connects to the current reality for our multilingual learners and the teaching and learning, and what is the idealized state that we've defined. As I said, it coheres to that language development approach. And as we think about the professional learning that all adults need, we think about the essentials, the professional learning essentials that I'm going to share in a moment, to make sure that our professional learning is balanced. So as myself and my colleagues thought about professional learning, because all of us have done a lot of professional development over our years, we thought of 3 large buckets or domains that you see here. We start with students at the center, knowing our students, who are our students, learning from our students. We then sort of scale out to defining and enhancing quality instruction. And then we have to include, which I've talked about so far, is sort of the system. It's not enough just to focus on students and instruction. It also is important to look at the system as a whole and make sure these aspects are included in professional learning. So what we have here, those 3 buckets are broken out into these 6 essentials. And again, these are all on our resources page. You'll see the 6 essentials, and for each one, there's a definition and examples of each one. So I can't do it justice here, but I think the title's give you an idea, and then if you want to dive in more, download the one. I want people to take a look, and I want you to pick out which one of these 6 do you think your school, your district has focused the most on, and then which of these 6 professional development essentials do you think, we should make sure we're embedding this into our professional learning going forward. So, for example, I might say that, I think we've really focused on designing lessons that support our multilingual learners, so essential 5. But perhaps we haven't done enough to connect the instructional practices to the research around language acquisition. So what ends up happening is our teachers are implementing strategies, but without a clear understanding of why they're doing that and how they support their students. So perhaps I want to make sure going forward in our professional learning plan that we are addressing essential 3, applying research to practice. Those would be mine. So go ahead now, and again, I'll give you another minute or 2, and you can jot in just the numbers if you want. Like, you can give yourself a thumbs up, or however you want to say, like, which of these essentials do you think in the last 3 to 5 years has been addressed in professional learning, and then which of the essentials do you think would behoove your district or your school to do more work on. All right, go ahead. You can just add it into the chat. Super helpful to see what people are putting. I'm curious when folks put essential 2 as something that they're addressing. I'm curious about evidence in terms of, are you thinking of evidence in terms of sort of summative assessments? Or are you thinking of responding to student evidence as more sort of formative evidence? Could be things like capturing student conversations and analyzing conversations, which is something that we do a lot. Capturing student writing, and again, in PLCs, reflecting on writing and next steps for instruction. Okay, I see portfolios, observations, nice. And so this, these essentials, I think, are a way or a lens of for people who are planning professional learning to think about, hey, are we doing enough of these things? Do we really know our students? Obviously multilingual learners are a heterogeneous group. Do we know enough about, making sure we understand the different typologies within that bucket called English learners? Okay. Great. Okay, fantastic. So I hope these are useful, and again, please, feel free to download them and use them to think about. It helps district leaders, could be site leaders as well, teachers, again, to determine next steps in professional learning, what kind of data, again, sort of the formative evidence. We're strong believers in the power of formative evidence to drive teacher capacity building. So that also that kind of evidence to monitor student growth and provide teachers with actionable feedback. It's very interesting as we do more and more work, having teachers look at, for instance, video or audio recordings of their students talking. What I see more and more is teachers bringing video, a short 2-3 minute video clip. Maybe it's a paired conversation, And so often teachers will bring in and say, you know what, Stephen, I was hoping kids were going to build on each other to build up an idea. But instead, all they did is student A, as you can see here, said one thing, student B was just waiting their turn, and then she said one thing, and then the conversation went nowhere. Do you have any suggestions of what I might do differently to really create an engaging conversation which kids build on each other to build up ideas? And I find that teachers are much more open to ideas about new strategies, new approaches when it comes from the students, rather than someone like myself in a transmission model saying, do this strategy, do that strategy, because it comes from what they're learning from the students. The focus is on the students and not on the teacher. So anyways, that's my 2 cents. So summing up what I was thinking about the systemic improvement plan work, a couple of things is, first of all, making sure that all professional learning includes connections to multilingual learners. So it's not that, okay, tomorrow we're doing the professional learning piece around multilingual learners, but the math, professional development, the language arts, the science, that doesn't, right? We've learned that's absolutely critical to include connections to multilingual learners in any professional development that's being done. Begin with a strong, clear vision of what quality instruction looks like. You have to define that, both in the sort of integrated classrooms as well as in the targeted ELD classes before developing a plan. Because if you don't, then what happens is the Christmas tree approach. If 3 different professional developments are good, well, then 7 is even better. And you get all these baubles put on a tree, all these different professional development pieces, but if they don't have coherence, then there's a whipsaw effect for teachers, because they never know, well, what is important, what is being valued here. But by having a clear vision that you've defined about what quality instruction looks like, then you can make connections between that and all of the professional development that is being offered. And then, identifying a couple of core competencies that teachers and leaders as well, and base it on some kind of research, some kind of evidence. So it could be in the case of key principles of ELL instruction, you may have others, but I think that's super helpful as you do the work. So let me stop there. Because after this, I'm going to talk about the ELD initiative that we were, but before we segue, if there are questions or comments that people have, I'm going to stop and allow for that, because I don't want to wait until the end and run out of time. You can put it in the chat or just unmute yourself. All right, well, if you think of a question or a comment, feel free to add it. We'll continue then, and I'll make sure that there's some time at the end as well. Okay, so my final question for myself, shifting gears, because what we noticed as districts started to define their programs, what do we mean by integrated? What do we mean by targeted? They realized that the quality of their targeted ELD was not where it should be. And in part, it was due to they either had publisher bought materials they weren't happy with, or they didn't have any materials at all for their teachers, and teachers were making it up on the fly. So my question to myself, and that people have asked me, is we're finding that our targeted ELD materials are not building on the strengths and providing the supports that would benefit our multilingual learners. What can we do about this? So in order to respond to that, and this is again work that I think I presented last year, we came up with this targeted ELD initiative that we began with one cohort of 4 districts in California on what we're calling co-constructing educator capacity through curriculum development. So it's a project that has targeted ELD teachers, coaches, English learner leads working together to develop curricular units, but the goal isn't so much the end product, that's important, but also in doing that work, in working together across districts, we co-construct capacity in ways that I think are deeper than just the transmission model of professional learning. So I'll go give a brief sort of idea of what it's about. And a lot of the work is based in what we call our ELD fundamentals, which again is in our resources. 4 fundamentals which we think are absolutely critical to driving changes in targeted English language development. So you see them here, the notion of purposeful communication to build ideas, to accomplish tasks, communication that's engaging, that bridges information gaps, where students want to say something, so it's authentic and it's purposeful. Thematic units is another fundamental in that I don't think it's fair to, especially for secondary targeted ELD teachers, to try and run around to every content area teacher to figure out what they're working on. But we can think about what are the essential disciplinary practices that cut across content areas. And in doing that, we might focus on, for instance, argumentation, which we know is valuable across all the content areas. And so what we do is we're coming up with these thematic units that focus on key disciplinary practices. And then finally, a language focus in which we understand the importance of vocabulary and grammatical structures, but it's not taught in isolation, but rather we help students develop their language skills in the context of meaningful texts. And by text, that could be written, that could be video, that are part of larger thematic units. So that's sort of the basis of the work that we started on this year. And as we've done that work, and again, I apologize if you can't see these, we asked the teachers, let's crowdsource what would be necessary in a powerful unit for your multilingual learners. What would be some of the key design features? And so folks, as you can see, put Post-its up, and we went back and forth on what are some of the key design features. And then eventually we came up with a number of these design features, and you can see there's a number of questions for these are just 2 of the design features, but we came up with reflective questions. So right now, our 4 districts are sort of in the final stages of crafting their units, and they're going to be using these reflective questions to revisit what they've created so far. Say, are we including these things? Let's make sure, and where can we enhance them? Because what we see is folks are either creating their own units, or again, if they have their own curriculum materials, what they're doing is saying, how do I enhance what I have? So this is, I think, a really nice tool so far, because it's created by teachers and leaders who are involved in this, and it's then connected to these ELD fundamentals. So I see some questions. I would think things like, argumentation, justification, attending to precision. I'm sure folks can put in a couple other, creating hypotheses. Folks can put other disciplinary practices. I can share a nice tool. I'll have to dig it up, and I can share it later, that was created by a former colleague of mine that shows the overlap in key disciplinary practices. So we'll make sure to get that out. And then, yeah, this is just some examples of the beginning sort of disciplinary units, or excuse me, the thematic units that folks were creating. And then, of course, as we're going along doing this work with teachers, we are providing some instructional strategies. There's just a couple of the ones, scaffolded, retail, text reconstruction, jigsaw. So teachers can take those strategies and then embed them in the lessons and units that they're developing. All right, so that's sort of the work we've done. Here's just a couple, this is just draft kind of stuff, so I'm just sharing it as a visual, but nothing more than that. So here's a group that's working on social justice, and they've come up with an essential question about what does it take to bring about change. They're identifying some language focus areas like cause and effect. They've been asked to identify what are some texts that they're going to use with some of the target language and language structures. What are the kinds of texts that students are going to generate? And then we want people thinking about what are the sort of final performances and products that they're going to come away with. Here's another one. This one's on music. We just had an amazing presentation on VAPA, visual and performing arts, and how to enhance units using the visual and performing arts to really get students engaged. It's amazing. So this group's working on why is music important? And again, you can see the texts and what students are going to come up with, and a little bit of what are the final products. So again, this is work in progress, but it's interesting to see teachers collaborating together to create these, and we're going to provide some feedback and support as well. So takeaways from this year of doing this work with this first cohort. No surprise, this was a very challenging year for all educators. Yes, if you don't know who that is, Napoleon Dynamite. And we also learned that it was best to first work with teachers to enhance their own lessons in the beginning, because we're giving them these ELD fundamentals and thinking about ELD in perhaps some novel ways. So starting with what teachers already have and making the bite size a bit smaller. Let's take a lesson, and where can you embed that lesson in one or two places that reflect the ELD fundamentals was super helpful before they went off now and are constructing larger units. Making sure that teachers connect back to sort of theory and research. So as they think about their practice, we ask them, okay, what fundamental does that speak to, or fundamentals does that activity speak to? So teachers keep in mind, oh yeah, that's right, that's why I'm doing this. No surprise, co-planning with peers benefits teachers, especially interesting across district. I think that's been really nice. And then again, finally, creating curriculum is not the only goal. Building educator capacities in doing the work. I think teachers and leaders are going to come away with more than just one unit. They're going to come away with the skills and the knowledge that they need to take to subsequent lessons and units when they, starting now and next year. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to provide some time. Questions folks have. I see there's some in the chat, but if people also want to unmute, I do see Casey asks a question about, is this within the main content classroom or ELD classroom? One of the other, I guess, takeaways I didn't have here is that as we engage in this work, people are saying, well, wait a minute. I know this is focused on targeted English language development, but this has got serious implications for what should be happening the rest of the school day. And we're like, yeah, that's right. As we do this work, it's kind of like the white space or the negative space in a drawing. You start to see, well, what should we be doing in the regular classroom? Because absolutely, there should be some of this work in the main content classroom as well. Other questions?
So just to build on that, Stephen, this is Casey. I'm the one that asked that question. So I teach at the secondary level, and I'm an ELL teacher for a high school. So our district is kind of going through a process of figuring out what is best for high school students and figuring out the kind of makeup of the program, whether it should be just all like push-in support and only receiving language in content classes, or having like a hybrid of them receiving that support in their content classes and within a self-contained ELD class that they would take for one period of the day.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, because obviously States are very wary of removing that specific ELD classroom, because then you're going to get people from the outside saying, wait a minute, you're not supporting or serving the needs of your multilingual learners. I would say that content area teachers need a lot of support and understanding of what their role is in doing this work. And, often, people will say, oh, content teachers, you're a language teacher as well, which immediately turns off content teachers, because they're like, I got so much to do. Now you're telling me I'm a language teacher as well. And instead, I like to think about what are the sort of, what's the language that students need to make meaning of your content? And I think if content teachers are thinking that you learn challenging content by using language to process your understanding, and you learn language in the face of grappling with challenging content, then the notion is, well, if students aren't processing their ideas using language, then they're not learning my content, math, science, social studies. And then it becomes, okay, well, what are some of the key, not just the vocabulary, but the sort of language structures that they need to make a hypothesis, to present an argument, to present a counter argument, to describe something. And then I think you might get to a place where content area teachers realize that there's real value in helping support students, because all students, very few students come to school with what I would call academic uses of language. I like to broaden, I like to move away from just academic vocabulary, because I'm worried that just becomes single words, but actually, what are the academic uses of language that students need? So if you're going to have a targeted ELD program, well, okay, then you need to think really carefully about what work is being done in there. And integrated teachers need to understand what's being done in that ELD classroom, because the ELD classroom is not to fix multilingual learners. That's not what that's about. But how do the content area teachers play a complementary role as well? All of this, again, comes back to doing the work to define what should be happening in those classrooms, integrated and targeted, and providing real examples. It's long-term work. I mean, that's why, in those graphics you saw, it was, 3 years of work that we thought about. So, but thank you, Casey. It's a great question. Other questions, comments? You can always, go ahead. I think someone might have shared, but in the meantime, you can always reach out to me. Thank you to everyone. I am the webmaster for Twitter, so if you tweet us, I will probably be the one to respond. Feel free and do that. And I'll make sure to get that disciplinary practices. I think that's super helpful, but do reach out. I think the last slide was just, yeah, you can reach out through that email. You can reach out through my email that I have up front. And then I'll make sure also that I'll have a copy of this slide deck in PDF form. I'll get that out as well to you. And with that, go take a 6-minute break. I'll stay on in case anyone else has questions, but thank you all for engaging. I was really impressed with the responses. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen. And
course,
I've dropped in the chat as well for everybody the link to our next session with Dr. Andrea Honningsfeld. We do start that at 3 o'clock. I think I might have said 2. Losing track of time here. It is at 3 o'clock. That session will begin. I'll see you all there.
Let me stop sharing. Let me see if I can find